The Crown's Secret, a five-part fictional drama. The marble corridors of Ravensholm Palace echoed with hurried footsteps as Lady Margaret Sinclair moved through the shadows of the East Wing. The ancient stones had witnessed centuries of royal secrets, but none quite like the one unfolding on this fog-laden Tuesday morning in October. Margaret's hands trembled as she approached the heavily guarded treasury room. The crown jewels of Avalonia had rested behind these walls for over 400 years, their sapphires and diamonds catching the light of 1,000 ceremonial occasions. Today, however, they would serve a purpose far removed from pageantry and tradition. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest like a stone. 3 months had passed since she discovered the truth about the royal finances, 3 months of sleepless nights and careful planning. The people of Avalonia deserved better than empty coffers while their monarchs lived in luxury built on borrowed time and hidden debts. Outside, the October wind rattled the palace windows, a fitting soundtrack to the storm about to break loose within these ancient walls. Margaret had served the royal family for 15 years, rising from a junior lady-in-waiting to one of the most trusted members of the inner circle. She knew every secret passage, every blind spot in the security system, every moment when the guards changed shifts. But she had never imagined she would use this knowledge against the very people who had become her second family. The morning routine proceeded as it always did. King Edmund III held his private breakfast in the Blue Salon while Queen Isabella reviewed the day's schedule with her personal secretary. Prince Nicholas, the heir apparent, had already departed for his military duties at the academy. It was the perfect time for what Margaret had planned. The Treasury Guard, a weathered man named Thomas Hartwell, had been with the palace for nearly 2 decades. His routine was as predictable as the changing of the seasons. At precisely 9:15 each morning, he would step away from his post to collect the daily security reports from the central office. The journey took exactly 7 minutes and 30 seconds. Margaret knew because she had timed it. As Thomas disappeared around the corner, his footsteps fading into the distance, Margaret approached the treasury room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. The electronic lock required both a keycard and a 6-digit code. She had obtained both through careful observation and a particularly unfortunate evening when the head of security had indulged too heavily in the palace wine cellar. The lock clicked open with a soft beat that seemed to echo through the entire palace. Margaret slipped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the magnificent display cases that housed the crown jewels. The state crown of Avalonia sat on its velvet cushion, its central ruby the size of a plum surrounded by over 2,000 diamonds. Beside it rested the queen's diadem, a delicate creation of platinum and sapphires that had adorned the heads of 7 queens. But it wasn't their beauty that drew Margaret forward. It was their value and what that value could accomplish. The plan had formed slowly in her mind over the summer months. The kingdom's financial crisis had been carefully hidden from the public, but Margaret's position allowed her access to documents that painted a dire picture. The royal treasury was nearly empty, drained by years of poor investments and excessive spending. Meanwhile, the people struggled with rising taxes and diminishing public services. The jewels before her represented enough wealth to fund hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects that could transform thousands of lives. They were symbols of a monarchy that had lost touch with its people, beautiful artifacts that served no purpose beyond ceremony while real needs went unmet. Margaret reached for the state crown, her fingers nearly touching the ancient gold when a voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Step away from the display case immediately." She froze, her reflection multiplied in the faceted surfaces of 100 diamonds. Thomas Hartwell stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the radio clip to his belt. His usual kindly expression had been replaced by something harder, more professional. "I can explain," Margaret began, but Thomas was already speaking into his radio. "Security breach in the treasury room. I need backup immediately." The words seemed to echo in the small space, each one sealing Margaret's fate. Within minutes, the sound of running footsteps filled the corridor outside. The palace guard arrived first, their faces grim and professional as they surrounded her. Behind them came the head of security, his expression thunderous. But it was the arrival of Prince Nicholas that truly marked the end of Margaret's carefully laid plans. The prince had returned unexpectedly from his morning duties, alerted by the emergency radio traffic. At 28 years old, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that seemed to fill any room he entered. His dark hair was disheveled from his rushed journey back to the palace, and his usually immaculate uniform bore traces of the morning's fog. "What exactly is happening here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone born to rule. Thomas Hartwell stepped forward, his report crisp and professional. "Your Highness, I discovered Lady Margaret attempting to remove items from the treasury room. She had already disabled the security system and was reaching for the state crown when I apprehended her." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret watched as understanding dawned in Nicholas's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked remarkably like betrayal. She had been present at his christening, had taught him to tie his shoelaces, had been a constant presence throughout his childhood and adolescence. "Margaret," he said quietly, and the disappointment in his voice cut deeper than any angry shout could have. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of shared history and broken trust. Margaret straightened her shoulders, finding courage in the righteousness of her cause. "Because someone has to think of the people," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "While you live in luxury, children go hungry in the streets of our capital. While these jewels gather dust, hospitals close their doors for lack of funding." Nicholas's expression hardened. "You don't understand the complexities of royal finance. These jewels are not mere possessions, they are symbols of our nation's heritage." "Symbols don't feed families or educate children," Margaret shot back. "Your grandmother's sapphires won't keep the lights on in the children's ward at St. Mary's Hospital." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but the arrival of King Edmund himself brought it to an abrupt halt. The monarch entered the treasury room with the measured pace of someone accustomed to dealing with crises, though the strain of the situation showed in the tight lines around his eyes. "Clear the room," he commanded, and everyone except Margaret and the immediate royal family filed out into the corridor. "Now, someone explain to me why my most trusted advisor is standing accused of attempting to steal the crown jewels." The story emerged in pieces, each revelation more damaging than the last. Margaret's knowledge of the palace's financial situation became clear, as did her growing frustration with what she saw as royal indifference to the kingdom's struggles. She spoke passionately about the letters she received from citizens begging for help, the reports of increasing poverty and desperation throughout the realm. King Edmund listened in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Margaret finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Lady Margaret, your concern for our people is admirable, but your methods are unconscionable. You have violated the most basic trust of your position." "I have done what needed to be done," Margaret replied, her chin raised defiantly. "History will judge whether I was wrong to try to help those who need it most." Prince Nicholas stepped forward, his anger finally breaking through his royal composure. "History will judge you as a thief who betrayed the family that treated her as one of their own." The accusation struck home, and, for the first time since entering the treasury room, Margaret's resolve wavered. These people had indeed been her family, had welcomed her into their inner circle and trusted her with their most precious secrets. But that trust, she believed, came with an obligation to serve not just the royal family but the kingdom as a whole. The immediate crisis passed with Margaret's arrest and the securing of the treasury room, but the deeper issues her actions had exposed could not be so easily resolved. The palace staff whispered among themselves, speculation running rampant about what had driven the previously unimpeachable Lady Margaret to such desperate measures. In the days that followed, Prince Nicholas found himself haunted by Margaret's words. He had always known that the kingdom faced financial challenges, but his understanding had been filtered through official reports and carefully managed presentations. Margaret's raw passion and detailed knowledge of the people's suffering forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the disconnect between royal privilege and common experience. The investigation that followed Margaret's arrest revealed the depth of her planning and the extent of her knowledge about the palace's vulnerabilities. Security protocols were immediately reviewed and strengthened, but the damage to the royal family's sense of security within their own home proved more difficult to repair. Queen Isabella took Margaret's betrayal particularly hard, having considered her one of her closest confidants. The discovery that someone so trusted could harbor such resentment and act upon it with such calculation shook her faith in her ability to read people and situations. As autumn deepened and the scandal began to attract media attention, the royal family found themselves facing not just the immediate crisis of Margaret's actions, but the broader questions her desperation had highlighted. The kingdom's financial struggles could no longer be hidden behind carefully crafted public statements and royal pageantry. The treasury room was sealed and its security completely overhauled, but the questions Margaret had raised about the purpose and value of the crown jewels continued to resonate throughout the palace halls. Her arrest had prevented a theft, but it had also forced a reckoning with truths that would prove far more difficult to address than any security breach. As winter settled over Ravensholm Palace, the ripple effects of Margaret's attempted theft continued to spread through the corridors of power like cracks in ancient stone. The arrest had been swift and decisive, but the questions her actions raised proved far more difficult to contain than any palace scandal in recent memory. Prince Nicholas stood at the windows of his private study, watching the first snow of the season dust the palace gardens. The view had always brought him peace, but now it seemed to mock him with its serene beauty while chaos churned beneath the surface of royal life. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrest, and each day brought new complications. The investigation into the security breach had revealed disturbing truths about the palace's vulnerabilities. Margaret's access to classified financial documents had gone unnoticed for months, her gradual accumulation of security codes and keycards attributed to her trusted position rather than any suspicious activity. The realization that someone could have been planning such an operation under their very noses sent shockwaves through the entire royal security apparatus. But it wasn't just the security implications that kept Nicholas awake at night. Margaret's accusations about the kingdom's financial priorities had struck uncomfortably close to home. His own investigation into the matters she had raised painted a picture of a monarchy increasingly out of touch with the daily struggles of its people. The morning brought another confrontation, this one in the king's private office where the immediate royal family had gathered to discuss the growing crisis. The room's rich burgundy walls and heavy oak furniture seemed to press inward, creating an atmosphere of suffocating tension. Queen Isabella sat rigidly in her chair, her usually perfect composure showing signs of strain. The past weeks had aged her, fine lines appearing at the corners of her eyes and a certain brittleness entering her voice when she spoke of household matters. The betrayal had cut deep, undermining her confidence and her ability to manage the complex web of relationships that kept the palace functioning. King Edmund reviewed the latest security reports with the methodical attention he brought to all matters of state, but Nicholas could see the weight of the crisis in his father's increasingly stooped shoulders. At 68, the monarch had weathered many storms, but this particular tempest seemed to be taking a heavier toll than usual. "The media attention is becoming unmanageable," the king announced, setting down a thick folder of newspaper clippings and online articles. "Every major publication is speculating about our financial situation and questioning the value of maintaining the monarchy in its current form." The criticism had indeed been savage. Editorial writers who had previously shown respectful deference to the royal family now openly questioned the wisdom of spending millions on palace maintenance while citizens struggled with austerity measures. Margaret's arrest had inadvertently provided a focal point for years of accumulated resentment about economic inequality. Nicholas cleared his throat, knowing that what he was about to say would not be well received. "Perhaps we need to consider that some of their criticisms have merit." The silence that followed was arctic in its intensity. Queen Isabella's teacup froze halfway to her lips, while King Edmund's expression shifted from surprise to barely contain anger. "Are you suggesting that woman was justified in her actions?" the Queen asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm suggesting that her desperation came from somewhere real," Nicholas replied carefully. "The financial reports I've been reviewing paint a dire picture of the kingdom's situation, while we continue to live in splendor that most of our subjects can't even imagine." The argument that erupted filled the office with decades of suppressed tensions about the role of monarchy in modern society. King Edmund defended the traditions and symbols that he believed gave the kingdom its identity and stability, while Nicholas pushed for reforms that might address the growing disconnect between royal privilege and common experience. Queen Isabella found herself caught between her husband's fierce traditionalism and her son's increasingly radical suggestions, her own beliefs shaken by the discovery that someone she had trusted implicitly could harbor such resentment against everything she held dear. The confrontation reached its peak when Nicholas suggested that perhaps some of the crown jewels should indeed be sold to fund public works projects, the exact proposal that Margaret had attempted to implement through theft. Absolutely not, King Edmund declared, his voice carrying the full authority of 4 decades on the throne. Those jewels represent centuries of our nation's history. They are not commodities to be liquidated at the first sign of financial difficulty. They're symbols, Nicholas countered, his frustration finally breaking through his usual diplomatic restraint. Beautiful, expensive symbols that serve no practical purpose while people suffer from problems we could solve. The debate continued through the morning, touching on fundamental questions about the purpose and legitimacy of inherited power in democratic society. Neither side yielded ground, and the meeting concluded with no resolution beyond an agreement to increase security measures and attempt to manage the media storm. Meanwhile, in the secure wing of the palace where Margaret was being held pending her trial, the former lady-in-waiting spent her days writing detailed accounts of everything she had witnessed during her years of service. Her cell was comfortable by prison standards, furnished with basic amenities and books from the palace library, but the isolation was taking its toll on someone accustomed to constant activity and social interaction. She had been allowed limited visits from her legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman named Helena Morrison who specialized in political cases. Morrison had reviewed Margaret's situation with the clinical detachment of someone who had handled many similar scandals, though she admitted that few of her clients had attempted anything quite so audacious. "Your case presents interesting challenges," Morrison explained during one of their sessions. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, but the motivations you've described might generate some public sympathy." Margaret shook her head. "I don't want sympathy. I want people to understand what's really happening in this kingdom while the royal family maintains the illusion that everything is fine." The legal proceedings were complicated by the intersection of criminal law and constitutional questions about the role of the monarchy. Margaret's intimate knowledge of royal finances and her willingness to testify about what she had discovered created potential for a trial that could expose far more than anyone had anticipated. The palace's legal team worked frantically to limit the scope of any eventual proceedings, arguing that matters of royal finance were constitutional issues beyond the jurisdiction of criminal courts. Margaret's defenders countered that her actions, while technically criminal, were motivated by legitimate concerns about governmental transparency and fiscal responsibility. Public opinion remained divided, with some viewing Margaret as a traitor who had violated the most basic principles of loyalty and service, while others saw her as a whistleblower who had risked everything to expose royal hypocrisy. Protest demonstrations appeared outside the palace gates, their chants alternately demanding Margaret's release or calling for harsher punishment. The international media seized upon the story with undisguised relish, comparing the situation to historical scandals and speculating about the long-term implications for the monarchy's survival. Royal families throughout Europe watched nervously as the crisis unfolded, recognizing that the questions being raised about Avalonia's monarchy could easily be applied to their own situations. As December arrived with its traditional round of royal Christmas preparations, the contrast between ceremonial splendor and underlying crisis became increasingly difficult to ignore. The annual Christmas ball, a highlight of the social calendar, proceeded as scheduled despite calls for cancellation, but the festivities carried an undercurrent of tension that no amount of champagne and orchestral music could entirely mask. Prince Nicholas found himself questioning everything he had taken for granted about his role and responsibilities. The weight of his future crown, once a source of pride and purpose, now felt like a burden inherited from a world that might no longer have room for the kind of monarchy he had been raised to represent. The investigation into Margaret's actions continued to reveal uncomfortable truths about palace security and financial management. Her detailed knowledge of royal spending patterns and investment strategies had allowed her to build a compelling case for reform, even if her methods for implementing change had been completely unacceptable. The Palace Board of Directors, a group of senior advisors responsible for overseeing royal finances, found themselves under intense scrutiny for the first time in decades. Their carefully managed presentations of financial data were suddenly being questioned by external auditors and journalists who had never previously been given access to such information. The scandal had torn away the veil of discretion that had traditionally surrounded royal financial matters, forcing uncomfortable conversations about accountability and transparency that previous generations of monarchs had never been required to have with their subjects. As the year drew to a close, it became clear that Margaret's attempted theft had catalyzed changes that would continue long after her eventual trial and sentencing. The questions she had raised about the relationship between royal privilege and public responsibility could not be answered with improved security measures or better media management. The palace staff, once absolutely loyal and discreet, now watched their employers with newly critical eyes. The revelation that one of their most trusted colleagues had harbored such deep resentment forced everyone to examine their own relationships with the royal family and their own feelings about the stark inequality they witnessed daily. The treasury room remained sealed, its precious contents now guarded by technology sophisticated enough to detect the slightest unauthorized presence, but the crown jewels themselves seemed somehow diminished by the controversy surrounding them. Their beauty remained unchanged, but their symbolic power had been tarnished by questions about their true value to a kingdom struggling with very real problems. The dawn of the new year brought no respite from the crisis that had engulfed Ravensholm Palace. If anything, the Christmas season had only highlighted the stark contrast between royal luxury and common hardship, as media coverage juxtaposed images of lavish palace celebrations with reports of families struggling to heat their homes during an unusually harsh winter. Prince Nicholas stood in the restored treasury room, now protected by security systems so sophisticated they could detect a mouse's heartbeat. The crown jewels gleamed under their protective lights, seemingly oblivious to the controversy that swirled around them. Each piece represented centuries of tradition, but Nicholas found himself seeing them through Margaret's eyes, beautiful, ancient, and ultimately useless to the people who needed help most. The legal proceedings had begun in earnest, with preliminary hearings that attracted international media attention. Margaret's case had become a lightning rod for broader debates about wealth inequality and governmental accountability, transforming what should have been a straightforward theft prosecution into a constitutional crisis. Helena Morrison, Margaret's attorney, had proven to be a formidable opponent who understood the political dimensions of the case far better than the palace legal team had anticipated. Her strategy centered on putting the royal family's financial practices on trial rather than simply defending her client's actions. Lady Margaret's attempts to address the kingdom's financial crisis may have been misguided in their methods, Morrison argued during one particularly heated hearing, but they were motivated by legitimate concerns about fiscal responsibility and transparent governance. The prosecution, led by Sir Geoffrey Winters, the kingdom's most experienced criminal attorney, struggled to keep the focus on Margaret's clear violation of the law rather than the broader issues her actions had raised. His task was complicated by the unprecedented nature of the case and the intense public interest in the underlying financial questions. Prince Nicholas had been scheduled to testify about the impact of Margaret's betrayal on the royal family, but, as the date approached, he found himself increasingly conflicted about what he would say. His own investigation into the kingdom's finances had revealed problems even more serious than Margaret had known. The royal investment portfolio, managed by a private firm with connections to several major financial institutions, had suffered significant losses over the past 5 years. Poor decisions and market downturns had eroded the traditional sources of royal income, forcing increased reliance on public funding at precisely the moment when such support was becoming politically untenable. More damaging was Nicholas's discovery of several questionable expenditures that bordered on the frivolous. The renovation of a rarely used palace wing had cost nearly £10 million, while the royal art collection had been expanded with purchases that seemed designed more to impress dealers than to serve any cultural purpose. The morning of his testimony, Nicholas sat in his private chambers reviewing notes he had prepared weeks earlier. The carefully crafted statements defending royal privilege and traditional prerogatives now seemed hollow in light of everything he had learned. The young man who had angrily condemned Margaret's actions 3 months earlier had been replaced by someone who understood, if not approved of, her desperation. His internal conflict was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Queen Isabella entered without her usual retinue of ladies-in-waiting, her face bearing traces of the sleepless nights that had become routine since the crisis began. "I know what you're thinking," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her son's desk. "I can see it in your face during our family meetings." Nicholas set down his papers and studied his mother's expression. Age and stress had sharpened her features, but her eyes retained the intelligence and determination that had made her an effective queen for over 3 decades. "What am I thinking?" he asked carefully. "That perhaps Margaret was right about some things," Isabella replied.
That maybe we have been too isolated from the real problems facing our people.
The admission surprised Nicholas, who had expected another lecture about loyalty and tradition. His mother had always been the more pragmatic of his parents, but she had also been fiercely protective of royal prerogatives and customs.
Have we? He asked.
Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her gaze directed toward the windows where snow continued to fall over the palace gardens. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of accumulated regret.
I've been thinking about my early years as queen, she said.
I used to visit hospitals and schools regularly, not for ceremonial purposes but to understand what was really happening in people's lives.
When did I stop doing that? When did managing the palace become more important than understanding the kingdom?
The conversation that followed was the most honest Nicholas had ever had with his mother about the role of the monarchy and their responsibilities to their subjects. Isabella revealed her own growing doubts about the sustainability of their current lifestyle and her fears about the kingdom's future under mounting financial pressures. Their discussion was interrupted by King Edmund's arrival, his face bearing the grim expression that had become his default in recent months. The morning's newspapers had brought fresh criticism, with several major publications calling for his abdication in favor of a more progressive approach to monarchy. "The situation is becoming untenable," the king announced, settling heavily into his chair. "The Prime Minister has requested a private meeting to discuss constitutional reforms that might address some of the concerns Margaret's actions have raised."
The revelation that governmental leaders were seriously considering changes to the monarchy's structure sent shock waves through the room.
For centuries, the relationship between Crown and Parliament had been governed by tradition and careful precedent rather than formal constitutional revision. Nicholas felt a mixture of vindication and terror at this development. His calls for reform no longer seemed radical in light of external pressure for change, but the prospect of fundamental alterations to the system he had been raised to inherit was deeply unsettling.
The family spent the morning reviewing proposals that had been circulating in political circles for weeks.
Some suggested modest transparency measures that would subject royal finances to regular parliamentary oversight. Others called for more dramatic changes, including the sale of significant portions of the royal art and jewelry collections to fund public works projects. The most radical proposal involved transforming the monarchy from a hereditary institution to an elected ceremonial position, similar to systems in some other European nations. While this option had little serious support, its mere existence in official discussions demonstrated how far the crisis had shifted the boundaries of acceptable political discourse. As the day progressed, it became clear that the royal family would need to make significant concessions to preserve any meaningful role in the kingdom's future. The traditional approach of weathering scandals through dignified silence and minimal concessions would not be sufficient to address the fundamental questions Margaret's actions had raised. The pressure intensified when several prominent members of Parliament announced their support for a comprehensive review of royal finances and constitutional reforms. These were not radical politicians seeking to abolish the monarchy, but moderate voices who had previously supported the traditional system. Prince Nicholas's testimony, when it finally came, reflected his evolved understanding of the situation. Rather than simply condemning Margaret's actions, he acknowledged the legitimate concerns that had motivated her desperate gambit while maintaining that criminal activity could never be justified regardless of underlying motivations. His measured response disappointed both hardcore monarchists, who wanted unqualified condemnation of any challenge to royal authority, and Republican critics who had hoped for more dramatic admissions of royal failings. But it accurately reflected the complex reality of a crisis that resisted simple solutions. Margaret herself remained a figure of intense public interest, with opinion polls showing the kingdom almost evenly divided between those who viewed her as a traitor and those who saw her as a heroic whistleblower. Her own testimony, when it came, was devastating in its detailed revelation of royal financial mismanagement and disconnection from public needs. She spoke with calm precision about specific expenditures that had horrified her, investments that had failed due to poor oversight, and opportunities to address public problems that had been ignored in favor of preserving royal comfort. Her presentation was so thorough and well documented that even her harshest critics had to acknowledge the accuracy of her information. The courtroom scenes were broadcast live throughout the kingdom, creating a daily soap opera that riveted public attention. Each new revelation about royal finances generated fresh waves of commentary and debate, keeping the crisis at the forefront of public consciousness in ways that traditional royal scandals had never achieved. International observers noted the unprecedented nature of the proceedings, with constitutional scholars debating whether the case represented a necessary evolution of democratic accountability or a dangerous erosion of institutional stability. The implications extended far beyond Avalonia's borders, as other monarchies watched nervously to see whether similar challenges might emerge in their own realms. The winter deepened, and, with it, the sense that fundamental changes were inevitable regardless of the trial's outcome. Margaret's attempted theft had catalyzed conversations about power, privilege, and responsibility that could not be contained within the narrow bounds of criminal proceedings. The palace staff began to notice subtle changes in their employers' behavior. King Edmund spent more time reviewing financial reports and less time on ceremonial duties. Queen Isabella initiated tentative contacts with charitable organizations she had previously supported only at arm's length. Prince Nicholas began making unannounced visits to public institutions, seeking to understand firsthand the problems that royal isolation had previously hidden from view. These changes were noted by a media establishment that had grown increasingly sophisticated in its analysis of royal behavior. Every gesture was interpreted as evidence of either genuine reform or calculated public relations, creating a climate of skepticism that made authentic change more difficult to achieve. As February arrived with its traditional round of royal engagements, the contrast between ceremonial obligations and underlying crisis became increasingly difficult to manage. The annual state opening of Parliament, typically a showcase of royal grandeur, was scaled back significantly in recognition of public sentiment about excessive spending. The verdict, when it finally came in late February, surprised no one and satisfied few. Margaret Sinclair was found guilty of attempted theft and breach of trust, crimes that carried significant penalties under Avalonian law. However, Judge Harrison's sentencing reflected the complex circumstances surrounding the case, imposing a suspended prison term and community service rather than the harsh imprisonment many had expected. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Judge Harrison delivered his reasoning, his words carrying weight far beyond their immediate legal implications. He acknowledged that Margaret's actions were clearly criminal and could not be condoned regardless of her motivations, but he also recognized the legitimate concerns that had driven her to such desperate measures. The defendant's intimate knowledge of royal financial practices revealed systemic problems that demand attention, the judge stated, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. While her methods were entirely unacceptable, the issues she sought to address remain valid concerns for this kingdom's future. Prince Nicholas sat in the gallery beside his parents, watching as Margaret received her sentence with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Her face showed neither triumph nor defeat, only a weary acceptance of consequences she had clearly anticipated from the moment she first entered the treasury room. The reaction outside the courthouse was immediate and polarized. Supporters of the monarchy denounced the lenient sentence as an encouragement to future challenges to royal authority, while Republican activists claimed that Margaret's light punishment vindicated their arguments about the legitimacy of her concerns. The media coverage was intense and unrelenting, with commentators from across the political spectrum offering analysis of what the verdict meant for the monarchy's future. International observers noted that the case had effectively put royal financial management on trial alongside Margaret herself, creating precedents that could influence similar situations throughout Europe. Back at Ravensholm Palace, the royal family gathered in the king's private study to discuss the implications of the verdict and their response to the ongoing crisis. The room felt different somehow, its traditional furnishings and ceremonial portraits seeming like artifacts from an earlier era rather than symbols of continuing power. King Edmund appeared to have aged years in the months since Margaret's arrest, his usually erect posture showing signs of the strain that had consumed his daily life. The criticism had taken a personal toll on a man who had devoted his entire adult life to serving his kingdom according to principles he had never before been required to question. "We cannot continue as if nothing has changed," he said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that his family had rarely heard before. "The old ways of managing these situations are no longer sufficient." Queen Isabella nodded slowly, her own evolution during the crisis evident in her willingness to consider reforms she would have rejected outright just months earlier. Her conversations with charitable organizations and public service groups had opened her eyes to problems that royal isolation had previously hidden from view. Prince Nicholas felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow at his father's admission. He had argued for months that significant changes were necessary, but seeing the monarchy forced to evolve under external pressure rather than choosing reform proactively left him feeling that opportunities had been missed. The discussion that followed was unprecedented in its scope and frankness. For the first time in living memory, the royal family openly debated fundamental questions about their role in modern society and their responsibilities to subjects who increasingly questioned the value of inherited privilege. The reforms they ultimately agreed upon would have been unthinkable before Margaret's crisis. Royal finances would be subject to annual parliamentary review, with detailed reports made available to the public. The most valuable pieces in the royal art and jewelry collections would be placed in public trust, ensuring their preservation while making them accessible to citizens who ultimately owned them. Perhaps most significantly, a substantial portion of royal expenditures would be redirected toward public works and charitable initiatives, with the palace itself taking a more active role in addressing the social problems that had motivated Margaret's desperate actions. These changes were announced in a nationally televised address that King Edmund delivered from the throne room, his words carefully crafted to acknowledge past shortcomings while outlining a vision for a more responsive and responsible monarchy. The speech was watched by millions of citizens who had followed the crisis from its beginning, many of whom had never before seen their monarch address them so directly about matters of such fundamental importance. The public reaction was cautiously positive, with opinion polls showing increased support for the monarchy contingent upon successful implementation of the promised reforms. However, significant skepticism remained about whether genuine change would occur or if the announcements merely represented sophisticated public relations designed to diffuse criticism without addressing underlying problems. Margaret herself watched the king's speech from the small apartment she had been assigned as part of her community service arrangement. Her sentence required her to work with charitable organizations serving the kingdom's most vulnerable populations, a task she approached with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her royal service. Her new position with the Children's Advocacy Trust allowed her to apply her organizational skills and intimate knowledge of governmental processes to problems she had long wished to address. The work was satisfying in ways that palace management had never been, offering direct contact with people whose lives could be measurably improved through her efforts. The irony was not lost on her that her criminal conviction had ultimately led to more meaningful work than her decades of loyal service had provided. The skills she had developed managing royal households proved invaluable in coordinating services for families in crisis, while her understanding of financial systems helped identify inefficiencies that had previously gone unnoticed. Prince Nicholas made several unannounced visits to observe Margaret's new work, ostensibly as part of his expanded public engagement duties but really to understand how someone who had known him since childhood could have harbored such deep resentment about the life he had been raised to consider normal. Their conversations, when they occurred, were awkward but illuminating. Margaret's anger had largely dissipated, replaced by a focused determination to make her punishment productive rather than simply punitive. She spoke about the families she now served with the same passionate knowledge she had once brought to royal protocol, but her enthusiasm seemed more genuine and sustainable. "I spent 15 years managing luxury for people who already had everything," she told Nicholas during one of these encounters. "Now I help coordinate basic services for people who have nothing. The work feels more honest somehow." Nicholas found these interactions profoundly unsettling, forcing him to confront uncomfortable questions about the value and purpose of his own privileged existence. Margaret's transformation from trusted advisor to convicted criminal to effective social worker illustrated possibilities for meaningful contribution that his royal role seemed to preclude. The reforms announced by his father were genuine and significant, but they operated within constraints that preserved fundamental inequalities. The monarchy would become more transparent and responsive, but it would remain a system based on inherited privilege and ceremonial luxury that many citizens could never access. As spring returned to the palace grounds, the immediate crisis began to fade from daily headlines, replaced by other scandals and political developments that captured public attention. However, the underlying questions Margaret's actions had raised continued to influence political discourse and public expectations about governmental accountability. The treasury room had been reopened with its enhanced security systems, and the crown jewels once again received their scheduled maintenance and occasional ceremonial use. But their symbolic power had been permanently altered by months of debate about their true value and appropriate role in a modern democracy. Guided tours of the palace, when they resumed, included new exhibits about royal finances and charitable work that attempted to demonstrate the monarchy's commitment to public service. The displays were professionally designed and factually accurate, but they could not entirely overcome the skepticism that Margaret's revelations had generated about royal priorities and lifestyle choices. The staff members who had witnessed the entire crisis from its beginning adapted to new protocols and expectations with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some embraced the increased transparency and public engagement as long overdue reforms that made their work more meaningful. Others mourned the loss of traditional discretion and ceremony that had previously defined palace culture. The changes were real and substantial, but they occurred within a framework that preserved the essential character of inherited monarchy. King Edmund remained king, Queen Isabella continued her ceremonial duties, and Prince Nicholas prepared for eventual succession according to protocols that predated living memory. Margaret's attempted theft had catalyzed evolution rather than revolution, forcing adjustments that addressed some public concerns while maintaining institutional continuity. Whether these changes would prove sufficient to sustain public support for the monarchy over the long term remained an open question that would be answered by future generations rather than immediate developments. The palace settled into its new routines as summer approached, its ancient stones adapting once again to changing times and expectations. The crown jewels continued to sparkle under their protective lights, symbols of tradition that had survived another challenge to their relevance and meaning. But, in the streets of the kingdom's cities and towns, conversations continued about power and privilege, responsibility and reform, questions that could not be answered by improved security systems or reformed financial procedures alone. 1 year after Margaret Sinclair's attempted theft, Ravensholm Palace had settled into routines that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations of royalty. The transparency reforms had been implemented with characteristic thoroughness, creating new departments and procedures designed to ensure public accountability while maintaining the dignity essential to monarchical authority. Prince Nicholas stood in his redesigned office, surrounded by charts and reports that tracked the kingdom's social programs and charitable initiatives. The room that had once been devoted primarily to ceremonial correspondence now resembled a policy center, its walls covered with data about hospital funding, educational outcomes, and economic development projects supported by redirected royal resources. The transformation had been more profound than anyone had anticipated. What began as damage control following Margaret's crisis had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of how the monarchy could serve its people in the 21st century. The changes were popular with the public, but they had fundamentally altered the daily experience of royal life. King Edmund, now approaching his 70th birthday, had embraced his new role as a working monarch with surprising energy. His days were filled with policy meetings and site visits that would have been impossible under the old system of carefully managed appearances. The transformation had given him a sense of purpose that purely ceremonial duties had never provided. The quarterly report shows remarkable progress, he announced during the family's weekly strategy meeting, a session that had replaced traditional ceremonial planning as the focus of royal scheduling. Hospital waiting times in the southern provinces have decreased by 30% since we redirected the art acquisition budget toward medical equipment. Queen Isabella nodded approvingly, her own evolution during the past year perhaps the most dramatic of any family member. Her renewed engagement with charitable organizations had revealed administrative talents that decades of ceremonial duties had never fully utilized. She now personally oversaw the distribution of royal resources to worthy causes with an attention to detail that impressed professional social workers. The Children's Advocacy Trust has requested additional funding for their literacy programs, she reported, consulting notes written in her characteristic precise handwriting. Margaret's work with them has identified several innovative approaches that could be expanded throughout the kingdom. The mention of Margaret's name no longer generated the tension it once had. Her transformation from palace betrayer to effective social advocate had been noted by everyone involved in the reform process. Her insider knowledge of royal resources and governmental procedures had proved invaluable in identifying opportunities for productive change. Prince Nicholas had maintained regular contact with Margaret throughout her community service period, their relationship evolving from wounded betrayal to grudging respect and, eventually, to something approaching collaboration. Her practical understanding of social problems complemented his theoretical knowledge of policy development in ways that benefited both their efforts. "I'm scheduled to visit Margaret's literacy project next week," Nicholas reported. The preliminary results suggest it could serve as a model for similar programs in other regions. These visits had become routine parts of his public engagement schedule, but they continued to provide insights that formal reports could never convey. Margaret's direct work with struggling families gave her perspectives on the effectiveness of various programs that policy analysts inevitably missed. The media had initially treated these interactions as evidence of either remarkable royal forgiveness or clever public relations, but the sustained nature of the collaboration had gradually convinced even skeptical observers that genuine reform was occurring. The monarchy was actually changing rather than simply appearing to change. The financial transparency measures had produced their own revelations, some embarrassing but most demonstrating the positive impact of redirected resources. Annual reports now detailed every significant royal expenditure alongside corresponding public benefits, creating accountability mechanisms that had never previously existed. The palace staff had adapted to their new responsibilities with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but overall morale had improved as employees found their work connected to measurable public benefits rather than purely ceremonial purposes. The transition had not been seamless, but it had been successful enough to suggest that more fundamental changes might be possible. International reaction had been cautiously positive, with constitutional scholars praising the Avalonian monarchy's successful adaptation to contemporary expectations while maintaining institutional stability. Other royal families had begun implementing similar transparency measures, recognizing that public demands for accountability were unlikely to diminish. The crown jewels remained in their secured treasury room, but their role had been fundamentally redefined. Rather than symbols of inherited privilege, they were now presented as national treasures held in trust for future generations. Public access had been expanded, and their ceremonial use was increasingly limited to occasions that directly served public purposes. Margaret's community service period was scheduled to conclude at the end of the year, but she had already accepted a permanent position with the Children's Advocacy Trust that would allow her to continue the work that had given her life new meaning. Her transition from palace insider to social advocate was complete, though she maintained informal advisory relationships with several royal reform initiatives. The conversation that had started with her desperate attempt to steal the crown jewels had evolved into ongoing dialogue about the proper role of inherited institutions in democratic societies. The questions she had raised were being addressed through systematic policy changes rather than dramatic gestures, but the fundamental issues remained complex and unresolved. Prince Nicholas reflected on these developments as he prepared for another site visit, this one to review a housing project funded through the sale of rarely displayed royal artifacts. The work was more satisfying than traditional ceremonial duties, but it also highlighted the limitations of reform that preserved essential structures of inherited privilege. His relationship with Margaret had taught him to see the monarchy through the eyes of people who experienced its effects rather than its benefits. The perspective was uncomfortable but necessary, forcing acknowledgement of inequalities that royal birth had previously allowed him to ignore. The kingdom had changed substantially in the year since Margaret's arrest, but the basic framework of monarchical government remained intact. Reform had occurred within existing structures rather than replacing them, addressing some concerns while leaving fundamental questions about inherited power unresolved. Public opinion polls showed increased support for the monarchy following the implementation of transparency measures and social programs, but they also revealed ongoing skepticism about the long-term sustainability of hereditary privilege in an increasingly egalitarian society. As the anniversary of Margaret's attempted theft approached, reflection on the year's developments revealed both the possibilities and limitations of institutional reform. The monarchy had proven capable of significant adaptation, but it remained to be seen whether such changes would satisfy evolving public expectations over the long term. The crown jewels continued to sparkle in their protected display cases, no longer threatened by desperate theft attempts but not entirely secure from the broader social forces that had motivated Margaret's original crisis. They remained symbols of tradition and continuity, but their meaning had been forever altered by the conversations their near loss had generated.
The palace grounds showed signs of approaching autumn as another season of change prepared to transform the ancient estate.
The buildings and gardens that had witnessed centuries of royal history were adapting once more to new expectations and responsibilities, their stones and pathways accommodating another chapter in the long story of monarchy's evolution. In the end, Margaret's attempted theft had achieved something that straightforward reform efforts might never have accomplished. By forcing a crisis that could not be ignored or managed through traditional means, she had catalyzed changes that addressed many of the concerns that had driven her to desperation. Whether these changes would prove sufficient to ensure the monarchy's long-term survival remained an open question, but there was no doubt that the institution emerging from the crisis was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before Margaret entered the treasury room on that foggy October morning. The kingdom continued its ancient rhythms of seasonal change and ceremonial observance, but, beneath the familiar patterns, new relationships were forming between rulers and ruled, traditions and innovations, privilege and responsibility. The conversation that Margaret had started with her desperate gambit would continue long after her own story reached its conclusion, shaping the future of institutions that had seemed unchangeable until someone had the courage to challenge their assumptions.